August 19, 1943, English Channel near Dover, United Kingdom. Cold fog drifted low over the water, thick as wool and heavy with salt. The shoreline was dark except for the faint red pulse of a shuttered signal lamp somewhere behind the cliffs. Waves tapped softly against the rocks below, slow and patient, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. On the narrow strip of shingle between water and wire, a 19-year-old farm boy stood alone with a weapon that should not have existed. The metal in his hands was crooked, ugly, welded from mismatched lengths of rusted pipe and scavenged springs that once turned milking machines back on his family's farm in Sussex. It looked more like plumbing than a firearm. The men who had watched him build it had laughed quietly when they thought he could not hear. Some had called it the plumber's nightmare. Others simply shook their heads and looked away. Elliot Kearns did not laugh. He checked the crude safety once more, the way he always did, fingers tracing familiar scratches in the steel. The wind tugged at his thin greatcoat. Somewhere beyond the fog, Germany controlled the night. What Elliot did not know, standing there on the edge of the channel, was that the next few minutes would send a tremor through naval warfare that would never appear in any official history book. Before we go any deeper into this forgotten moment of World War II, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell me in the comments where you're watching from around the world. These hidden stories deserve to be remembered. 3 hours earlier, the warning siren on the cliff above had howled once, then gone dead. Radar contact had dropped without explanation. No incoming aircraft. No shell fire. Just silence. The kind of silence that made officers sweat beneath their collars. Elliot had been pulled from his post without ceremony. No briefing. No reassurance. Only a major with tired eyes and a clipped voice had pointed toward the fog and said, "If that thing of yours can do anything at all, tonight is when it matters." Now alone on the shore, Elliot stared into the mist where the black water met the darker sky. His heartbeat kept time with the tide. Every sound felt magnified. The scrape of shingle under his boots. The soft tick of cooling metal from the gun's crew chamber. The distant churn of engines he could not yet see. He thought, for a moment, of the farm. The smell of oil and hay. The way broken machines had always found their way into his hands. Pumps. Feed grinders. Irrigation valves seized with rust. He had never learned from a book. He learned by listening to how metal complained under strain. He learned by feel. By failure. By fixing what others gave up on. When the war came, he brought that same instinct with him. The army had not known what to do with it. Britain in 1943 was strained to the bone. Weapons were scarce in some coastal units. Factories were stretched thin. Improvisation became policy long before anyone dared call it that. When Elliot's detachment was ordered to reinforce a stretch of coast that had already lost 2 radar stations to unexplained failure, their supply trucks arrived half empty. That night, a major had set a pile of discarded machinery in front of Elliot and given him one sentence. "By morning, we either have something that works or we have nothing at all." Elliot had worked through the night by lantern light. Sparks flew into the darkness. Springs snapped. Metal screamed under heat. What emerged by dawn was heavy, misaligned, and unpredictable. The barrel was barely straight. The firing assembly came from 3 different devices that had never been meant to share the same purpose. No one believed it would fire twice. Now, weeks later, that creation rested against his shoulder as the fog began to thin. A shadow broke through the mist. Low. Long moving with deliberate certainty across the water. A German patrol boat. It cut through the channel without lights, a black shape against blacker sea. Its engines were quiet enough to be mistaken for distant surf. Far enough offshore that no rifle could reach it. Close enough that any shelling would give British positions away. This was the moment radar was meant for. Radar was blind. Elliot felt the unseen enemy in the pit of his stomach. It was not the boat itself. It was the clock. The slow, inevitable tightening of time as the patrol moved closer to the shore positions hidden along the cliffs. If it passed unchallenged, more would follow. He raised the pipe gun. The metal was cold against his cheek. The weight of it pulled at his arms in a way no proper rifle ever would. His breathing slowed without conscious thought. He had no target reticle, no precise sight, only the fog, the shadow, and the memory of how the internal coils vibrated when the trigger was pulled. He squeezed. The weapon did not roar. It thudded, low and contained, a mechanical heartbeat rather than a gunshot. A faint ripple moved through the mist in front of him. The shadow offshore lurched. On the patrol boat, hidden from Elliot's sight, navigation instruments flickered. Targeting gyros stuttered. For a fraction of a second, every electric system aboard the vessel disagreed about where the boat was in the world. The helmsman overcorrected. Steel kissed stone beneath the waterline. The boat vanished into fog and spray without a single shell fired. Along the cliffs, no explosion followed. No alarm, no confirmation. Only the slow return of tide against rock and a silence deeper than before. Elliot lowered the gun, unsure whether anything at all had happened. High above, officers stared at their instruments in confusion as contact simply disappeared. No wreckage surfaced, no flare burned, and no entry that night would ever appear in any combat log. If this forgotten ingenuity moves you, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Quiet heroes shaped this war more than history admits. By morning, whispers moved through the encampment like smoke. The patrol boat was gone. The channel remained clear. Radar still showed nothing. The official explanation was mechanical failure on the enemy's side. Elliot's major did not repeat that explanation. He only looked at the crooked weapon in the farm boy's hands with a new expression. Not admiration, not fear, calculation. 2 days later, without ceremony, Elliot was transferred from his unit. No destination was given to the men who watched him leave. The pipe gun was taken from him and sealed in a crate marked only with a sequence of numbers that meant nothing to anyone on that beach. But the weapon was not destroyed. It was studied. In a hidden workshop in Wales, beneath a disused rail yard, engineers dismantled his crude assembly bolt by bolt. They tried to replicate it with precision machining. Their versions were cleaner, straighter, safer. None of them worked quite like his. Elliot never knew. He was reassigned to infantry, given a standard rifle, told to forget his experiment ever existed. Weeks later, he found himself crouched in hedgerows across the channel in Normandy, mud in his teeth and artillery in his ears. The sea he had once guarded now thundered behind him with the weight of an invasion. He never knew that the real value of his invention had not been to strike a single patrol boat. Its true purpose was only just beginning to unfold at sea. Pause for a second and hit subscribe if you believe ordinary people change wars. And tell me where you're watching from. This story crosses oceans. While Elliot fought in fields and villages, something strange began happening far beyond the range of any infantry weapon. German naval gunners reported brief targeting distortions across multiple engagements. Shells that should have struck cleanly instead clipped at unnatural angles. Salvos that should have found range fell just wide. The reports were scattered, isolated, easy to dismiss amid the chaos of war at sea. All were quietly filed and forgotten. By the time the pattern began to form, the damage to enemy certainty had already begun. And somewhere beneath the American East Coast, far from fog and cliffs, a man named Harold Voss would soon make a discovery that, without ever meeting a farm boy from Sussex, would become fatally linked to that crooked pipe gun. But for now, all Elliot knew was that the war had swallowed his invention without leaving so much as a ripple behind. And the sea kept its secrets. Beneath the eastern edge of the American seaboard, under layers of concrete and steel designed to absorb the shock of sabotage or bombardment, a sealed naval laboratory glowed with light that never saw the sun. September 1943. Maryland shipyard. Midnight shift. The air smelled of heated metal, ozone, and stale coffee that had been reheated too many times. Dr. Harold Voss stood alone at a workbench, staring at a strip of alloy that should not have existed. It was no wider than 2 fingers, dull gray, unremarkable to the eye. Yet everything the instruments were telling him defied the rules he had spent his life obeying. The tensile strength numbers on the gauge climbed beyond the upper range of the scale. The metal did not crack under stresses that should have shattered conventional naval steel. It bent. And when it bent, it folded inward, as though it were swallowing force instead of releasing it. Voss removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He had checked the readings 3 times. He had recalibrated the equipment twice. The error could not be in the machines anymore. It had to be in his calculations. Hours earlier, fatigue had betrayed him. A decimal place had shifted in a chemical ratio that had been standardized for decades. A mistake small enough to go unnoticed on paper. But the alloy it created was anything but small. He repeated the test. The result held. He repeated it again. The result refused to change. Something in that accidental formula was redirecting explosive energy instead of dispersing it. Shock waves collapsed back into themselves. Fragmentation patterns inverted. The physics was wrong, and yet the steel in his hands proved it right. When the rear door of the lab opened, Voss did not hear the footsteps behind him. He heard only one word: forbidding. The stamp came down on his report less than an hour later. Red ink across white paper. Every copy sealed. Every reading classified above his access level. Armed guards appeared at the laboratory doors before sunrise. No one explained what he had created. No one asked his permission to use it. Within 3 weeks, a single British destroyer was quietly fitted with small test sections of Voss's alloy along its forward plating. The ship's name was omitted from most records. Its departure from port went unremarked. No press. No ceremony. Only an entry in a ledger marked with a letter that meant nothing to any junior clerk who handled it. In October, in waters the Atlantic kept restless and gray, that destroyer met a German escort group at range. The first shell struck just below the waterline. It should have torn the hull apart. Instead, the explosion folded inward. The shock wave collapsed back into the armor. The internal bulkhead held. The blast dissipated in a way no naval engineer could have predicted. The crew survived. The official after-action report blamed a defective German round. Only one sealed memo told the truth. If discoveries like this stir something in you, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from. The world was shaped by moments no one was meant to see. In Maryland, Voss was informed that his services were no longer required in open research. His clearance level was altered without discussion. His access narrowed. His questions went unanswered. At night, alone in his quarters, he replayed the numbers in his mind. He knew the alloy could not possibly function in isolation. The way it redirected energy required certain impact conditions to work at all. Without the proper strike geometry, the effect would collapse. Someone, somewhere, was shaping how enemy shells struck his metal. He did not yet know how. Across the ocean, in a place that did not exist on any map used for civilian travel, the crooked pipe gun was being reborn. The Welsh workshop was buried beneath a decommissioned rail yard. Freight lines above rattled with coal and armor bound for ports. Below, under dim lights and reinforced ceilings, engineers studied the farm boy's creation. They discovered quickly that it was not a firearm in the traditional sense. It was not built to kill. It was built to interfere. When fired near active targeting systems, the pipe gun unleashed a burst of electromagnetic disruption that lasted only fractions of a second. Too brief to be detected as an attack. Long enough to cause gyroscopes to disagree with power supplies. Long enough to make trajectories drift. Long enough to make shells strike wrong. Attempts to replicate Elliott's work through conventional engineering failed. Precision machining ruined the effect. Standardization destroyed the instability the crude welds had produced. Only when imperfections were deliberately introduced did the disruption return. They learned to reproduce the flaw. By early 1944, modified versions of the device were quietly installed along key points of the English coast and aboard select Allied support vessels. The operators were never told what the guns truly did. They were instructed only when to fire and where. Meanwhile, German naval gunners began reporting errors they could not explain. Their instruments told them they were on target. Their shells told a different story. Salvos clipped at strange angles. Direct hits resulted in damage that appeared inverted. Internal explosions behaved as though the ship's armor were bending the laws of physics itself. It was neither miracle nor coincidence. It was design. Back in Normandy, Elliot Kearns moved through hedgerows under rain and fire like any other infantryman. The war had reduced him to the same condition as everyone else. Mud, exhaustion, orders, noise, fear. He fired his issued rifle, without knowing that the weapon he had once built was now woven into a contest unfolding far beyond the reach of small arms. He never learned that his invention no longer belonged to him. At sea, the pattern deepened. An Allied convoy absorbed a surprise attack that should have crippled it. 2 direct shell impacts failed catastrophically in the same inward-folding manner as before. German commanders began whispering of impossible luck. Faulty munitions. Sabotage at the factories. None of them guessed that a silent interaction between crooked metal and forbidden steel was rewriting the nature of naval combat in real time. History teaches that generals and admirals decide wars. If you believe forgotten hands mattered just as much, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're listening from. Voss continued to track every report he could access. Even as his clearance shrank, he learned to read between the lines of redacted documents. Ship names vanished. Tonnage figures blurred into ranges. But the physics remained legible. Every successful deflection shared the same abnormal impact signature. He knew, somewhere, something was shaping how force met his metal. In April 1944, a sealed intelligence file crossed his desk by mistake. It was there for less than 10 seconds. Long enough. The document referenced electromagnetic interference, events coinciding with abnormal shell behavior. The timestamps matched the engagements he had studied. A coastal defense classification appeared alongside them. Beneath that, a procurement identifier sequence. The same numeric pattern used on the crate that had once carried Elliot's pipe gun away from the English shore. Voss's breath left him slowly. 2 discoveries. One designed to guide. One designed to receive. Neither man aware of the other. The truth was too dangerous to exist outside sealed rooms. The program could not afford witnesses who understood it fully. By the summer of 1944, the system was complete. The enemy never saw it. At sea, battles unfolded according to rules Germany did not realize had already been changed. On land, boys like Elliot fought and fell without ever knowing the larger machinery they had set in motion. In November, word began circulating through narrow channels of intelligence that a major German heavy cruiser had been assigned to hunt Allied shipping routes that had proven unusually resilient. The stage had been set. The crooked pipe gun's quiet influence would soon meet the full weight of forbidden steel in open water. And when it did, the outcome would not only rewrite one engagement, it would erase the men who made it possible. November 1944. North Atlantic. Gray seas under a slate sky that never quite lifted its weight from the horizon. Wind tore white into the waves and flattened it again. The kind of weather that swallowed sound and distance and made steel feel small. Somewhere beyond the fall of the swells, a German heavy cruiser moved with deliberate patience. Its guns had shattered convoys before. Its armor had endured storms of shellfire. Its captain trusted his instruments. He trusted his range tables. He trusted the laws of physics that had never failed him. 5 hours earlier, Allied tracking stations detected the cruiser's approach. Its silhouette cut through the sea lanes like a blade designed to carve supply lines open again. Orders moved quietly through channels that very few men understood in full. Positions were chosen. Windows were calculated. Signals were set. And far from the ocean surface, inside rooms that no maps recorded, a decision was made to allow the system to face its first true test. On the Allied side, the task force steamed in disciplined shadow. Destroyers screened the heavier ships like nervous hands. The sea pressed hard against their hulls. Somewhere aboard those vessels were thin sections of steel that did not behave like steel. Somewhere along the coast and on trailing support craft, devices descended from a crooked farm-built gun were waiting. Elliot Kearns was not there to see it. 6 days earlier, in a hedgerow in Normandy, he had been caught in a crossing of machine gun fire as his unit advanced through rain and smoke. There was no ceremony, no final message, only the sudden absence of breath and the slow quieting of mud beneath his body. A boy who had once bent machines back into motion lay still among broken leaves and trampled grass. He never knew what followed. In the Atlantic that night, the German cruisers' forward guns opened fire. The first shell screamed across the water with the sound of tearing sky. On the Allied vessel, somewhere beneath the deck plating and wiring, a device fired silently. No muzzle flash, no roar, only a surge of invisible interference that lasted less than a heartbeat. German targeting gyros wavered. Power supplies disagreed with their own readouts. The shell struck at an angle no gunnery table could predict. It hit. The impact should have gutted the ship. Instead, the forbidden armor did something no one watching could explain. The explosion collapsed inward. Fragments bent back toward the point of contact, as if pulled by a hand no one could see. The internal shock wave folded against itself. Bulkheads held that should not have held. Men were thrown. Lights died and returned. But the hull did not tear. The crew lived. The German captain adjusted. He trusted the next salvo. The second shell hit. Again, the inward collapse. The third shell struck higher on the superstructure. Again, the blast folded wrong. Confusion replaced certainty on the cruiser's bridge. Instruments remained steady. The data insisted on direct hits. The visual reality contradicted everything the crew had learned to trust since cadet training. 5 confirmed impacts followed. 5 deflections that should not have been possible. Something in the sea that night was lying to the laws of force. Hours later, Allied ships closed in under cover of darkness and storm. The cruiser, damaged but not by anything that made sense, took a torpedo broadside she could not evade in time. By dawn, the heavy ship burned low against the waves and then slipped beneath them, carrying with it officers who would never understand why their shells had failed. Official reports credited superior gunnery and positioning. The real explanation returned to silence. In Maryland, word reached the sealed laboratory in staggered fragments. A successful test. Full interaction confirmed. Voss read the coded summary in a locked room with 2 guards at the door who were not his colleagues. He saw the signatures he had been waiting for. The inward collapse pattern. The impossible survival curves. His hands trembled as he slowly understood the whole design. It had never been about stronger steel alone. It had never been about electromagnetic disruption alone. It was the timing between the two. One to bend the path of force. One to receive it in a way no known material could. Voss finally saw what had been built without either inventor ever being allowed to see the full shape of it. 2 strangers. 2 mistakes. One system that quietly altered the rules of maritime warfare. Within weeks of the cruiser's loss, Voss's name vanished from public research logs. His lab access was revoked. His desk cleared. His personal notebooks confiscated under classification orders, so high even the memos acknowledging them were sealed. To the outside world, Dr. Harold Voss simply returned to anonymity. Inside the machine he had helped build, he became a liability. At sea, the pattern repeated in smaller engagements. Ships survived what should have destroyed them. Enemy confidence eroded in ways commanders could not quantify. German engineers argued with their own data. Factory inspectors searched for sabotage that did not exist. They never found the truth because the truth was not in one place. It was split between a farm in Sussex and a laboratory in Maryland. Elliot's body was buried beneath a simple marker with a name and 2 dates. No record there spoke of inventions. No citation hinted at significance. To history, he was one more infantryman among thousands. Yet the crooked pipe gun he built from scrap did not die with him. It remained in service, hidden, replicated, refined only enough to preserve its flaws. Voss lived years after the war in quiet rooms and unlisted offices, occasionally consulted on problems whose solutions disappeared into sealed envelopes. He was never allowed to publish the formula that had changed how metal met explosive force. The alloy was never named in public record. It became a material that officially did not exist. Victory followed victory across oceans. Naval warfare evolved without ever acknowledging the moment it bent. And in the years that followed, historians puzzled over engagements that looked wrong on paper, shell trajectories that should not have produced survival, damage patterns that refused to align with known physics. Survivors testified to impossible luck. Analysts wrote long reports that ended in unanswered questions. In a forgotten archive, two files sat within a few shelves of each other. One contained the testing history of a forbidding naval alloy. The other held the development notes of an ugly pipe gun built by a boy who fixed broken farm machines for a living. No public index ever linked them. Perhaps no one on the outside was ever meant to. The war ended. The seas grew quiet again. New weapons rose. New doctrines formed. And the silent partnership between crooked welds and forbidden steel faded into classification codes and dust. Yet every modern naval engineer still works in the shadow of forces they cannot fully see. Force does not always behave as it should. Explosion does not always obey expectation. Sometimes the smallest hands bend the largest rules. And sometimes history changes without ever admitting who changed it. If stories like this remind you why forgotten courage still matters, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell me where you're watching from around the world. I read every comment. These voices deserve to be heard.